Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. In this episode, we speak with Kimberly Kirkendall, founder and president at International Resource Development, Inc., a company whose focus is to help both U.S. and Chinese companies operate more effectively in the overseas markets. We talk about Kimberly's very unique China story that started professionally at a very young age, and after her now 30 years working there, how she's seen the business environment change and evolve. We also talk about how Kimberly evaluates a business opportunity in China and the tools she typically leans on to make those decisions. Kimberly also gives us her recommendations for conducting business in China effectively with some pretty raw anecdotes and how, in a nutshell, a brand can optimize their operations in China. Enjoy.
So what happens a lot of the time is that it's not to that guy's best interest to create a really robust operating procedure, because then they don't have the excuse to be Superman and fly over and fix everything. So a lot of companies, without realizing it, have embedded Superman into their processes. And now during the days of COVID, Superman's not going anywhere. So now suddenly you've got R&D issues. You can't get a design project through. You can't get a quality issue resolved. You've had a team in China for 10 years. Why the heck have you had a team there 10 years and you still need to fly these 2 engineers over every 3 months?
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Kimberly, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start with a bit of a background on how you ended up in China and spending so much time there?
So I moved to China in 1986. And when I'm speaking in person, I always joke that I must have been 12 at the time, but sadly, that's not true. I'd studied international business in college, and this was the mid-'80s recession in the U.S. I was fluent in Spanish. International business was a new degree in most U.S. universities, and I was basically afraid I wasn't going to get a job. So I took a class in Asian cultures. The Japanese are not fans of women or foreigners because Japan was the big up-and-coming trading partner at the time for the U.S. Toyota and Honda were really just getting started. Thailand, great country, nice people. Korea, also a little misogynist, but I like the Korean culture. But then China, I thought this is a country that, 1+ billion people, and it's starting to open up. I think that there's going to be some opportunity here. And then I felt an affinity for the village aspect of the Chinese culture. It's very much like living in a small town. People are very relational. They speak in analogies. It's a lot about, how we get along. And I grew up in a small town that my family had been in for generations. And I thought, I feel comfortable with this. I can do this. So when I started studying Chinese, everyone thought it was a really stupid idea. I was at the Ohio State University, and I think I was the first business major to take Chinese. And it was mostly intellectuals in my class because, Chinese is very difficult. And so you had to be an intellectual to study Chinese. And people really thought it was a complete waste of time, and for years that it was a waste of time. And then OSU had an exchange program. 2 students could go to Beijing, at the time, Language Institute, which was the #1 language college in the country. In China. And then 2 of their English teachers could go to Ohio State to learn how to teach English better. So they got the better end of the deal, right? But then going to Beijing for a year, who gets a scholarship from communist China in 1986? So my roommate was a Czechoslovakian professor from Prague who was studying Chinese for a year to do a dinosaur dig. She was a geology professor or something. And then we had Pakistani military and African diplomats' kids. And, the Russians weren't allowed near us. The Russians always had to be off to themselves. They couldn't even hang out with the other Eastern Europeans. So it was a great time that year in China. Learned a lot, miniature United Nations. I love reading people from that time. We had hot water 2 nights a week for 2 hours, which was better than the average Chinese population who had it 1 night a week for 2 hours at work where they could shower. But I really learned that year, I always say most foreigners go to China with arm's length relationship. They have a translator, they have a car and driver, they're living in the expat hotel. We had a little bit of a buffer, but not much. I mean, we had $50 a month scholarship money, and we had to survive and deal with being, the security apparatus around what the foreign students were doing and who we were talking to and all of that. And then I ended up being in China for another 4 years after that. A US company hired me because they had set up 2 factories in a very tiny village north of Suzhou, north of Changshu on the Yangtze River. And at the time, China was testing joint ventures. So they set up the Chinese government set up a US corporation that became the foreign partner in this factory. So my US client, my US employer really didn't have any ownership, but we set up and ran the factory. So the company had a gentleman before me, an American, for 2 years, setting up the factory, 2 factories, training all the workers, putting everything in place, and they hired me. And I'd never set foot in a factory in my life. I think I was 22 or 23 at the time. And after, I didn't ask for 6 months. After 6 months, and I knew that they were happy with the job I was doing. I had an office in Shanghai. Back then, no freeways. So it would take 3 or 4 hours to get to this village, what now would take an hour and a half, 2 hours without traffic. So I would go there on the weekends, work with the factory, the plant, come back to the office in Shanghai. We rented employees because you couldn't employ anyone directly. There was no mechanism for setting up a company, really. It was very, very, 80s, this was 87, 88, 89 when I was there and working there. But it was great. So I finally said to my boss after 6 months, why did you hire me? And, because I said I knew nothing. And he said, well, we realized we could teach you manufacturing faster than we could teach somebody with 30 years manufacturing how to work with the Chinese. Like, having been a student for a year, you already knew, like, just intuitively, this isn't going to work. Like, I can't do this. And so I call that my MBA. I worked with all Chinese men that were older than me, 10 to 30 years older than me. So I learned how to do business, the hardcore state-owned entity, government, protracted negotiation. So I'm a pig in mud when it comes to that. I can negotiate and do deals like that all day long. Love it. Makes me happy. Feels like home, And then other people complain now, and I'm like, oh no, babe, I got that. And then they sent me to Hong Kong, and I ran the Hong Kong office and replaced someone in Shanghai for my position, and had all the Southeast Asian suppliers and international customers. So I spent my first 5 to 6 years out of college basically all in China. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I got started with it.
That's amazing. And I love that you mentioned how when you first went there, people speak in analogies. Mm-hmm. The analogous way of talking. It's been described in a lot of different ways. A very poetic way of talking, constantly quoting Confucius, never saying anything directly. And that really threw me for a loop. Being more of a kind of blunt instrument type of person, I prefer directness, and I don't understand nuances of not being direct. Did you find it difficult, or maybe you being very young at the time allowed you to be maybe more nimble and open to it? I really struggled with that analogous way of the way people spoke. I could not pick up what they were putting down because they didn't put it down directly. Did you struggle with that?
Well, you know what's interesting? Chinese is what's called a high context language, as is Japanese and Arabic. And so part of that is what you're talking about is that context part of the language, which is the majority of communication in high context languages is indirect interpretation of the other person's intention and motivation and body language and all of those things. And to your second point, because I was so young, we now understand more about, if I always say if I was going to go back to college for anything for fun, it would be like neurolinguistics and, things like that. Cause I love the ideas around how language influences, how we think and process. So, my brain wasn't fully formed at that age. We're physically forming connections and wires in our brains up until about 25. And so I was forming the adult judgment, reason, processing part of my brain in a fully Chinese environment. So I became and still am very adept at the high context language part of it. And that's very comfortable for me. So what many foreigners feel when they go to China, especially at 30 or 35, or, when their brains are wired and they have built up expectations for how you behave in business or social situations, everything feels like you're running up against this wall of wrong. I felt that coming back to the US. I felt like, why are they doing this? Like, why I managed very Chinese, the first teams I managed in the US, how to manage up with my supervisors, how to manage laterally the teams that reported to me when I got back to the US. Even today, I'll have aha moments I'll be telling someone the career decisions I made when I moved back from China. And they'll look at me like, well, why would you think A was more important than B? And I think because I was using a Chinese brain at the time, I was valuing things in a very Chinese way. So yeah, it definitely, I think one of the difficulties for foreigners that start out at a later age in China is that you are wired. So very subconsciously wired to process and learn and communicate and make decisions and value things from your environment. And it's much more difficult to adjust to the other culture's environment.
I agree. I had a similar issue when I first came back. I actually went to San Francisco after I left China for the first time, and I really struggled. I went through 2 different organizations in about 9 months and couldn't quite adjust. Had difficulty with my staff. I had a lot of difficulty integrating with the existing infrastructure, both culturally and business infrastructure. And I found myself quite lost and confused about how things were operating and how things, in my opinion, weren't ever getting done. Did you experience something like coming back from the 996 and trying to adjust?
Yeah, I think what's part of what is a big adjustment coming back is that in China, typically, especially back in the day, but even today in many ways, typically foreigners are there because you have a particular expertise. And so you're in a position of authority. And, the Chinese culture is very deferential. So, you're the guest or you're the boss. And so people are very deferential to you. So you're able to and you also don't typically have oversight from the home office. So you're in a position to make decisions and get things done and move quickly, and it's not that Chinese organizations necessarily get things done faster in a sense. They're very hierarchical. So if you can get to the top and the top says do it, it gets done. If your communication is at the bottom, then it can take forever to get anything accomplished because the top hasn't approved it. But many times foreigners are only engaging at the top of an organization because of what your position is and what your counterpart's position is. So when you're used to that and you're really operating as a lone wolf in many situations working in China, to come back to your home environment and it's also very colonial in the sense that as a non-Asian, the rules don't apply to you. So, and that's also changed, especially in the last 5 or 10 years, because there's so many foreigners in China now. that the police and the average population don't cut you slack if you, jaywalk or break a rule. But 30 years ago, 35 years ago, I mean, I could walk into the Irish embassy unquestioned because I was white. And they weren't going to ask me if I was Irish or not. I just walked in. So and that's one of the reasons I left after 5 or 6 years, is that what my friends and I noticed was they're people who become lifetime expats in some way because they like not fitting in. They like not having the rules apply to them. They're comfortable being that lone wolf. And when they go back to their home environment and people are not deferential and you have to play ball in someone else's court, then they can't do it, especially when they're over 10 years or 12 years or the longer you are, outside of your environment. And I just didn't want to have that choice taken away from me. I wanted to come back when I would be able to reconnect in my own culture and to be able to function in my own culture. And then if I wanted to, I travel back and forth quite frequently, normally, obviously not COVID time, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it too.
You made a good point, also talking about people who come there but don't really live in China. They, as I used to call it, they live on China. They are there with Intel or Goodyear or Accenture or Fidelity or PwC or somebody, and they have drivers. They're put up in hotels. They have IEs. Their kids' schools are paid for, which they're getting charged $50,000 a year to go to, but they don't have to foot the bill. And, they're not really there. But you were there, and you did live in China, truly lived in China. How have you seen the business environment in China evolve or change over the past 30 years?
Well, I think I call them drive-by guys. That's my nickname for it, but I like on China. I was criticized quite heavily in the early 2000s because people would say to me, your experience in China in the late 80s and early 90s isn't relevant anymore. China in 2005 is a completely different place. It's a completely different place to do business. Everything's different here. Your old ways don't matter. And I used to say to them, you're wrong. You're operating at the veneer level. Right? At the veneer level, it's the new China, the modern China, and we're going to be open and everything's going to be capitalist and you're welcome to come here and make money. I said, beneath that, we're in the 1980s, we're in the 1970s. The moving the Communist Party and apparatus and how it functions, it's harder to move than a barge. So and people would tell me constantly, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And so now in the last 4 or 5 years, now that China is some of the veneers cracking or they're replacing it with a new veneer. And it's a more muscular Communist Party, engagement in the world and in business. People are bemoaning that and wringing their hands and saying, oh my God, China's changing for the worst. And I'm like, you keep missing the point. It's not changing. I'm right. What I was saying in 2005, I'm being proven right because now you're seeing that it's always been this way. That's just not who you dealt with or the face they chose to show you. But that doesn't mean it wasn't the underlying, musculature of the country. So I think one of the reasons, the other thing I get criticized, I post on LinkedIn what I think are very middle of the road conversations around commercial technical transactions and business changes in China. And I try to stay out of the politics. And some people, there was a very famous person who writes a lot about China who was attacking me quite a bit a year or two ago on, you love China and you're defending China. And I'm like, look, I never bought into it's going to become capitalist and open up and become more democratic. So I'm not disappointed.
Yeah.
So just because you bought into that and now you're disappointed, don't be upset with me. because I'm not disappointed. I never expected what you expected in the first place. I've been a realist from day one. And that was, I think, one of the other benefits for me. A lot of the students who went to China, the European and American, the more developed nation people in the mid 80s, they were in love with either communism as a concept, that it's better for the people, or ancient Chinese traditional culture. And I didn't go over for either of those reasons. I went over for purely selfish. I'm going to be able to make a career here. And I wanted to live internationally right out of college, which is not easy to do, especially as a woman. Mm-hmm. And I thought this is the best choice for me. So I've never been disappointed because I never had the rose-colored glasses on in the first place.
Would you say that it's easier to do business? And I mean, we could talk even back from the late 80s when you were there the first time, or the 90s or the 2000s. Pick whatever spot you want. Is it easier now? Is it harder now? Or is it neither, just different?
I think what factors into answering that is the generations. So let's think about the Chinese generations. So the people who are still in power, but they're aging out, are people that really grew up, were children at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. So they've seen a huge amount of change in their lives. They're closest to our World War I, World War II generation in, North America and Europe. So they're very risk averse. They're very command and control driven. So the way they do business is very top down, hierarchical, lots of structure, hold your position. Then the next generation is the one that came of age in the 80s and 90s, as China was starting to open and change. They're the most Western facing, so they're the ones in their 40s now, and they're, early, late 40s and early 50s. So they're the ones that are the easiest to do business with in many ways. They're the most Western facing. They came of age in China when they were looking at Western capitalistic models for business, and Jack Welch, is a great guy for them and all that. So that generation's people that came to China with that generation from the West, that's an easy generation to work with in many ways, right? And then the youngest generation, 35 and under generation, is very, very nationalist, because China was, as they were opening, didn't want to lose, adherence to the Communist Party and being proud of and loyal to China. So they really ramped up the nationalist rhetoric in the schools for that generation. And they only know wealthy, successful, anybody can be a millionaire China. So for them, they're difficult to do business with because they're not all that interested in what Westerners think or say or do. They're very confident about their opinions and what they're doing and how they want to do it. And they don't need you, So I think what's changed now, if you look at the foreigners, okay, you're over 40, I would say, 40 into 50 generation. They typically came into China when China was starting to open and it felt easy. And so now it feels hard by comparison, because that veneer is coming off. The younger generation isn't as thankful that white face is here. The Chinese have become much more capable. Back 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of trained private management in China because everything was coming out of a state-owned entity phase. So you could be a rock star just because you had some private business experience. And now coming into China, you have to be a rock star, you have to be a rock star because you're better than other people who have the same skill set you do. So the oldest foreign generation to come into China, they were hostile to China. The ones in their 50s and 60s, they were hostile to China because when they first came in, it was on the coattails of an agent from Taiwan or Hong Kong. And those guys came into China and said, oh, the Taiwanese are honest and the Chinese lie, and you can't, all that kind of rhetoric that these guys heard when they first came. And they believed it. The foreigners believed that and adopted that. And they can never really trust the Chinese, especially if they did business, because Taiwan and China are like, Britain and the United States. I mean, we may share a language and a heritage to some extent, but business is extremely different. It's done very differently. And most people don't appreciate that. But I find the younger generation of expats, let's say 40 and under, 35 and under, they typically they don't have the struggles in China in many ways, because they also, like the younger Chinese generation, they respect that this is a developed country, and that they expect people to have an opinion and to have a capability of being a good entrepreneur and being a successful person. So they really don't have the mental baggage that the 35 and up generation tends to have, for two different reasons. The oldest ones because they bought into the Taiwan, Hong Kong sort of, you can't trust the Chinese, and then the, let's say, 35 to 55, because when they came over, they were colonialist, white-faced gods that could do whatever they wanted to do, and now that's not the case. So the younger generation of foreigners, I feel, really, and that's why it's very funny, because on, a lot of business forums and on LinkedIn, I get along really well with the younger expat generation, because that's my perspective. This is the reality of China. I don't have rose-colored glasses, and I expect them to be intelligent, entrepreneurial, capable partners, and I don't have to cross over a lot of mental boundaries to get to that. It's natural to me. So I think that, is it harder or easier? I think it depends on what Chinese generation you're talking about, what foreigner generation you're talking about. From a government regulatory standpoint, it's definitely easier. I mean, there's no question that it's easier. But you also have a lot more domestic competition. So market entry is not as easy, because you're not the first foreign language school, and you've got hundreds of competition, Chinese company competition. So people are complaining about, I can't get into the market now, and it was easy for me 20 years ago. And I want to say, duh. You were the first one in the market 20 years ago, and now it's flooded. Why would you think it would be as easy?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about your company, International Resource Development. You help businesses find opportunity in China. And then you can correct me, but how do you evaluate a business opportunity in China? And are there any specific tools, data sets, places you go where you can lean on these tools or advice or data?
Okay, I'll give two, answer the first statement and then the second one. So I've had International Resource Development has been around for about 20 years now. And the first 10 years, it kind of rode the wave of China opening, right, from 2000 to 2020. So the first 10 years was opening plants for various companies, major corporations, name brand corporations that I help them, site selection, setting up the plant, negotiating with the government, hiring the workers, getting it up and going. So a lot of the first 10 years was that, and supply chain, problems and dealing with suppliers and all of that. The second 5 years, so from 2010 to 2015, it was a lot more about sales and sales offices, and how do we get into the market in China, and what is our channel development, and how do we look at things. And then the last 5 years have been what I call the oh shit moments. I still have set, I think 4 or 5 years ago, I had 2 factory setups at the same time. I've set up sales offices. Right now, I've got a client, we're looking to sell their manufacturing company in China, because the margins aren't enough for them to keep their capital there. But they're setting up 2 joint ventures on the service side and the software side, which is, again, very indicative of kind of how things are changing. So now it's more of, or I get calls from clients I've worked with for 10 or 15 years. We have, inventory at distributor A. We want to change to distributor B in China. We need to move the money from the US, but the goods are only going within the country, and that's difficult to do. And how do we do that? So it's a lot more problem solving. And I always say that my niche is typically, I'm very technical on the commercial transaction side. So I spent my 20s in supply chain and manufacturing. In my 30s, I became a CPA. So I do the tax, Chinese side, VAT tax. The state of Ohio calls me with questions on China's VAT tax. HR labor law, how do we shut down a company? What's severance look like? But the intersection of those transaction details, but also the cultural side of why do they keep asking me for this document, and why are they telling me this when they mean, when I think what they mean is something else, right? So it's the intersection of those two things. So then the second question was evaluating opportunities. And I think that, you need to use the same metrics that you use in any situation. What is my market? What is my market size? If it's on the sales side, what's my market? What's my market size? What kind of channel do I use? Am I going to start out with an agent and then a distributor and then a couple technical salespeople, and then eventually I'll manage the key customers myself, and then maybe I'll have my own distributors. It's the normal growth cycle that you see in almost any country. The challenge is data collection. Because in most established economies, you have Dun and Bradstreet, you have 50 or 100 years of data, publicly available data on that company, and who are their customers and how are they transacting business and have they ever been sued. And in China, it doesn't have that kind of public database. You can get a certain amount of information about when the company was founded and their initial registered capital and that sort of thing, but you're not going to get really robust information. And so you need to rely on indirect information gathering. So you have individuals who go physically to the location of the target if you're looking to acquire a business, or to the customers. You have to reach into a network of people to ask about that company, that market, that business, find out what's going on. But what's challenging, I think, for a lot of foreign companies is it's a very indirect, opaque form of information gathering. And if they don't have resources in China to do that for them, or they don't themselves have those resources, then they're not going to get information. So for example, I got a call from a private equity company a few years ago, and they said, it's Monday, right, when they called me. They said, we are putting a bid on a US company. We have to put the bid in on Friday. It's a blind bid. We understand they had a factory in China that they shut down, and that they now are using an OEM manufacturer that they're reliant on. That's the only manufacturer of some significant part of their production. We heard about you, because all my business is referral. I have no advertising. They said, we heard about you. We want to know what of that is true. And so I had like 3 days, right? So I reached out to my people, and I with one of my clients' permission, who was in a very similar industry, we made an arrangement. I call these James Bond visits, right? We made an arrangement to go visit the OEM manufacturer representing a third-party company as a potential customer, right? And we go into the factory, and one of the many things I love about China and the Chinese is that they're honest to the point of being naive in so many circumstances. And so my representative is in the factory and talking to them and saying, so do you have any foreign customers? Yeah, we have this big US customer. Well, how's that going for you? And they're like, oh, they went bankrupt a few years ago. Their China business did. And they owed us like $500,000, but we're collecting it because we're upcharging everything we sell the US by 10 cents until we collect the $500,000. And we've collected about 200,000, but there's 300,000 left to collect. Well, none of that was disclosed to the buyer, in any way. And then I sent someone else to go to the physical plant location, which was an hour or two outside of Shanghai. And they get there, and there's notices posted all over the office building and in the factory. You haven't paid your rent, and again, I sent a British girl, you know? So she's standing in the middle of an industrial park an hour and a half outside of Shanghai on her own. And the Chinese around her are like, what are you doing here? You know? And so she starts talking to them. So what happened to this factory? And they're like, oh, they shut down. They never paid their suppliers. And then we confirmed that they hadn't actually liquidated the business. So you're looking at $300,000 or $400,000 of undisclosed liabilities that I was able to report back to my client for the, you know, not a hell of a lot of money, frankly, that I charged him for that. And that allowed him to adjust his bid. So he didn't win the bid because he was higher than people who didn't know about that. So information gathering in China, looking at an opportunity, in my opinion, it's the same basic, you know, process and metrics that you would use in any opportunity, whether it's a supplier or a customer. It's how you gather that information and how you verify that you're really assessing the channel properly and understanding how the sale is being made for your type of product category and how what is the payment terms typically for your type of product? Because they can very, very commonly in China be 3 months or 6 months or a year. So where Americans or foreigners go wrong in these assessments is not that they shouldn't be following the standard process. It's that they're making assumptions during that process about, well, everywhere around the world it's net 30, or, you know, we're a big player in the market. We can insist on net 30 terms, or we value our product because it improves safety in the coal mines. That's why the Chinese are going to want it. When in fact, that's not why they want it. They want it because the other big name companies have it, and it's a brand thing. You know, so I think that it's the way that you go about collecting data and assessing the opportunity that's very different.
And I would say understanding, I mean, data collection, as you said off the top, is difficult. But then being able to read the data, to understand what are the markers I should be looking for, what are the red herrings, which is BS, which is truth. Just being able to decipher and distinguish between the data is a whole nother ballgame in of itself.
Yeah, very true. And it's one of the companies I did some work for starting probably 10 years ago, but they were in a very challenging industry. And so the US company was hemorrhaging money and struggling. And so they asked me to temporarily they terminated their international sales VP. And they said, can you run our China office, you know, for a few years? We're looking for a buyer. So I had set up the company in China. I had hired the staff. I knew their business and their market. So it was logical for me to take it over. And, you know, I'm in China constantly normally. So, but at one point I had a meeting with the management in the US, and they said, why don't we just eliminate the whole distributor level? Why are we even using distributors? Why don't we have our own sales team? They're going to the end user to make sure that our component is spec'd into the equipment that they buy, multi-million-dollar equipment. Why do we need the distributor? And they'd been in the market for 7 or 8 years, and yet somehow between their Chinese staff and their American manager, either it had not been articulated or they had not heard it, right? One or the other, or maybe both. So what the situation was the distributor was providing a financing function, because the US wanted to sell the component, which was like $10,000, $15,000 a piece. They wanted to sell it and collect immediately. Well, the equipment manufacturer wouldn't get paid from the end customer for a year or two. And they didn't want to put out all the money on the componentry, and because they weren't going to get paid for. The end customers were government entities. So the distributor would add on a 30% markup because they had to carry that receivable for 12 to 24 months. And, you know, interest rates in China because nobody does, the banks don't do operating capital loans. The banks do asset-based loans in China. So operating capital comes out of the shadow market, you know, shadow lending. And shadow lending is 20 to 30% annual rates. So their 30% markup, which seemed to the Americans like pure easy money profit that we could absorb. When I explained to them, do you want to finance this trade? for 12 to 24 months, then yeah, we can save the 30%, you know, and then try to collect it too, right? And they said, no, we'll keep the distributors. So that's just one of those things that companies assume that the buying process is similar to what they're used to, or they look at it from a purely written on a piece of paper. We sell to the end user, who specs to the OEM, and the distributor imports it and sells it to the OEM. So if we cut out the distributor, it's all okay. They don't see underneath it the value that's being created by the different people in this chain, in the channel.
Mentioned earlier, and again, I'm highly paraphrasing here, but you love to get muddy. Love to negotiate. It's your fun place. So, if I could channel Professor Kirkendall here from the Ohio State, go Buckeyes. Can you give our audience a bit of a lesson on conducting a business negotiation in China?
It's everyone hears and reads and understands that China and many high context language countries are relationship driven. And so the first thing that's important to understand is that in negotiation, you're typically negotiating with what they perceive, even if you don't, as a partner, as someone that is either selling to you or, buying from you. And that's a relationship that's going to be ongoing. And so the negotiation, it's, I have a class that I started for Disney 20 years ago. They asked me to come down and teach their supply chain teams how to work better with their Chinese suppliers. And I teach it to companies in groups of like 20 and under, and I've taught thousands of people over the years. And, I always say to them that, Chinese negotiation, it's like you're holding hands, like you're shaking hands, and you've got a good grip on their hand because you're friends. And if their daughter needs a kidney, you're giving her one, right? And in the other hand, you have a knife. And it's that frenemy relationship of, we're going to hold on. We're not going to let go. I might be stabbing you. You might be stabbing me. But at the end of the night, we're going to go have dinner and drinks. And truly, the friendship is there, right? It's really, truly there. And if you really, really, really needed it, if you came to me as a friend and said, I need you to knock $100,000 off that $1 million price, one way or the other, because I am not going to keep my job, they will see what they can do to make that happen. But it's difficult. Americans, especially over the last 40 years, have abandoned relationship business in most ways. I mean, there's some industries in some part of the country where it's still done, but we've become so much more, and I blame it on our lawyer lobby. We're so liability driven and fearful of showing favoritism or not getting the bottom price. And it's all about objective, not subjective. So, people don't want to have that. They don't trust themselves even. Like, how do I manage that relationship? So in negotiation, you need to understand that it's a partnership, and that if I'm giving a little, they're giving a little. You need to slow down. We tend to be go, 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 go about this. You need to take a pill. You need to relax. You need to let it happen over a couple days. You're going to talk about it. They're going to say yes. They're going to leave. They're going to come back and say no because someone else said no. And getting mad doesn't help you. It doesn't help them. So it really is finding out what are their KPIs. Frankly, Chinese negotiation works anywhere in the world because it's rooted on human nature. It's rooted on the understanding of what is this individual's weakness? What is the organization's weakness? How can I make this guy look good to his boss? What are his KPIs at the end of the year? What's their short-term needs? What their long-term needs? And so many Westerners, and I'll pick on Americans because I am American, but so many Americans in particular, it's like it should be simple. It should be, I'm paying you $2, you want it or not. We try to take the human out of it, which is foolishness. It's not going to work. Humans, you can't take the human out of it, out of business or out of negotiation or out of any of this. So I feel like the Chinese are not necessarily, negotiation in China isn't difficult because they're making it more difficult. We're making it difficult because we're trying to strip all of the messy humanness out of it. And they lean into the messy humanness of it.
I want to ask you a fun question, just to interrupt before we get to our last question. Your thoughts on Baijiu?
The quality of Baijiu has improved dramatically since the late 80s. Let's start with that. So it was, you think it's bad now? Like, oh my God, you have no idea. No idea. And you could always tell a smell worse than Baijiu, like, in its natural form, is when it's being sweated out of some guy in the morning in the gym after he drank too much the night before, because that is just rancid right there.
Yeah.
So it's gotten much better over the years. I think it's, I've drank my share of Baijiu. I can drink Baijiu. I typically, when I take clients to business meetings, what's nice is that over the years, it's a lot less challenge drinking than there was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. 20, 30 years ago, a big part of the big splashy dinners and the drinking fests were that people didn't make enough money to barely feed themselves, and they couldn't afford alcohol on their own. So going out to a business dinner was a chance to load up on calories, honestly, and at the company's expense, and to be able to have alcohol when you couldn't really afford it yourself. So as a business person in the late 80s and early 90s, I realized that if I didn't agree to go to some, how they take you on these weekend tours here and there, if I didn't agree to go on a weekend tour, they couldn't go. And they had maybe never been to see that site with their wife and daughter or whatever. And taking me allowed them to go, or it allowed them to have a meal that night, that was more than they could eat normally. So I think that culture fed in for about 10, 15 years into all the eating and drinking style and way things are done. I think now that people have so much more money, there's less pressure on someone to drink. There's less pressure on you to eat certain foods or a lot of foods, than there was before. But I train my clients with Baijiu strategies. So, if you've been to a dinner, I'm sure you have been to many, but that they often have their 5 guys, right? And maybe there's only 2 of you. So each one of the 5 of them will toast you individually. So you're drinking 5 times and they're drinking once. So you've got to bring your own, in the West, we have designated drivers. I always say in China, there's designated drinkers. You bring your own drinkers, and then those guys your guys can individually, toast each one of them to get them drunk. Right. So it's all of these games. I was in the middle of nowhere in probably Gansu or Hebei province at a very tiny village factory and I had this American, probably 27, 28-year-old engineer with me. We were looking at this factory because the Chinese company wanted a joint venture with the Americans. This kid was 6'4", 300 pounds of ex-football player body mass, right? And we went to lunch and I said, there's going to be a lot of drinking. And he's like, I'm good. I can drink. And I said, all right, just telling you, if you need to, you challenge drink, you can, I would always hold the cup in my hand so you can't see how much of it I drank. I could drink half of it and then I would re-pour it before I'd set it down. So I was only gombaying with half, not the whole thing. I have all kinds of fun little strategies with that. But what this kid did was that he and the Communist Party rep is always the biggest drinker. I swear to God, they get their job because they can outdrink everyone else. So he and the Communist Party rep were going toe to toe on the alcohol. And at the very end of the lunch, the Communist Party reps are 120 pounds soaking wet, and maybe 50. So that guy's at the very end, he's like, all right, one more drink. And the young guy looks at him, he goes, okay, I'll drink what's left of mine and I'll also drink hers, what was left of my glass. So he lifts up 2 glasses. And in my mind, I'm cringing because I'm thinking, honey, you're going to have dinner with them tonight. They're going to be scouring the countryside. for somebody who can outdrink the guy they brought to lunch, because you've embarrassed the crap out of them right now. So when we left, I said to him, look, dude, I got to go. I've got a train tonight because I got another client business tomorrow somewhere else. But are you going to be okay tonight? Because they're going to bring out they thought this was a big enough gun for you. They're going to bring out the big guns, dude. He's like, if I have an hour or two nap, I'll be fine. And I saw him back in the US when we were debriefing with corporate. I saw him back in the US and I said, how'd it go? He's like, I was fine. I told the company, can I just take him with me on like all future trips? Because this guy is awesome.
All right. Last question here. I'll try to get you out of here. You do a lot of work of helping brands and companies who already are in China to really optimize their operations. How do you do that?
Well, I think, I've done a lot during the COVID lockdown. I've probably done 30 webinars for various government organizations around the country and, nonprofits. And a good portion of some of it's on e-commerce, which is kind of how we met originally. Mm-hmm. E-commerce, social media marketing, but also supply chain operations, a lot of those things. And I tell companies, I don't care what you think of your operations system, for how you're buying goods or, managing your factories overseas, your sales office. I don't care how good you think it are. I guarantee you I will rewrite it. Because number one, the majority of the time, it's not in writing. Mm-hmm. A lot of how the business is run on a granular day-to-day level is not in writing. Mm-hmm. It's assumed that the Chinese will understand if we send over a purchase order, we've done it 10 times before, this is how they should handle it. And Americans are, again, picking on Americans because I am one, but they always say, how could the factory have done X, Y, Z? How could they have screwed this up? How could they? And I'm like, well, show me where you told them what to do, and a lot of times it doesn't exist. We tend to write, number one, a lot of North American, European companies have grown up over 30, 50, 70, 100 years. And you have all this tribal knowledge in the business of how things get done, or in your industry, how things are done, how they were done elsewhere. And that's not written down. And you can't assume that China or any other country in a different business environment with different laws and regulations and norms is going to do things the way you do. So you need to write it down, and in detail, to the point that a 12-year-old could pick it up and either make it or process the documents or whatever it is. So that's a big part of it. And so one of the things I often say to companies is, your documents are written like policies, not procedures. A policy is, you should drink 8 ounces of water every 4 hours. That's a policy. A procedure is, at 9 a.m., and at 2 p.m., you're to sit in this chair for 15 minutes. With your right hand, you grasp a glass with your thumb pointing you and your fingers away that's filled with 8 ounces of water. And you're going to lift it up and you're going to tilt it and drink from it for those 3 minutes until it's empty. And we don't write like that, because in our culture, it's insulting. Mm-hmm. It's insulting to someone to give them that level of detail. And in the Chinese culture, for, again, my Disney class, variety of reasons, it is insulting not to give me that much detail. It's because you're leaving me to fail if you don't give me that enough detail. And so that is my number one overreaching, how do you fix your operations, is communication, written procedures. We start often with clients with an authority matrix, who has the authority to decide, in these key turnover points, who decides, who is notified, and are there dollar amounts or size or timing amounts or whatever upon which it's, requires more authorizations. And so many times when we work on these projects, many of these things are things the company has not even really considered. So it's not just about taking what they're doing and writing it down. It's a very collaborative process of challenging and saying, why is that working for you? If it's not working, why? How do we want to do it? And then how will it fit within the Chinese business structure? With, in China, VAT tax drives so many business decisions. What your sales price is, how you invoice customers, how frequently you invoice, how many employees you have in the accounting department. I mean, it really is and we don't have VAT tax in the US. So Americans have zero understanding of how it's calculated and how it drives business. And so that's just one example of where Americans might have one set of accounting procedures for their operation in China, expecting that $100 million plant could have a controller and one cashier, when the Chinese would have probably not a controller even, but they would have 3 or 4 staff accountants and a cashier, because there's so much transactional paperwork. And accounting in China is very compliance driven. It's in the West, it's very management accounting. How do we use accounting to manage our business? And in China, accounting is how do we comply with government taxes and regulations?
Understood.
So again, I also have client problems where the American controller is saying, why isn't my Chinese accountant able to answer me? Is she incompetent? Or she doesn't understand the business, or she's lying. And it's because she's a compliance accountant who doesn't process the accounting information in such a way to even think about how it impacts our future cash flows, or how we make go, no-go decisions on adding new products. Mm-hmm. So there's just so many things in. So it's number one, it's writing everything down, which I guarantee you don't do, companies don't do. And then number two, it's the nuance of how do decisions get made? How is the environment different in the other culture, in the other country? How are the transactions different? How does that drive the operations? Mm-hmm. And it's really those two things that we really get very deeply into to help resolve. And I think right now with the supply chain disruption that we're seeing around the world, it's showing us a lot of our weakness in our supply chain. So it's a good time to fix those things. The other one I would mention quickly, mm-hmm. and these are all my quasi-trademarked phrases, okay. But it's what I call the Superman syndrome. So a lot of foreign companies, they have a couple engineers, or in a smaller company, it may be the CEO or vice president. This is the guy who helps set China up, whether it's their suppliers or their own factory or their sales office. When he goes to China, he's Superman. We're kind of back to the colonialism. He's taller, richer, and better looking, just like Superman is in his uniform. Hmm. When he comes home, he's Clark Kent. His wife wants him to take out the garbage. The other managers in the office don't really respect him. His boss gives him shit. But when he's in China, he's staying in a luxury hotel and everyone takes him out to dinner and they tell him how fabulous he is. So what happens a lot of the time is that it's not to that guy's best interest to create a really robust operating procedure, because then they don't have the excuse to be Superman and fly over and fix everything. So a lot of companies, without realizing it, have embedded Superman into their processes. And now during the days of COVID, Superman's not going anywhere. So now suddenly you've got R&D issues. You can't get a design project through. You can't get a quality issue resolved. You've had a team in China for 10 years. And I've said to the companies, why the heck have you had a team there 10 years and you still need to fly these 2 engineers over every 3 months? Like, really? To the tune of $100,000 a year in cost? Do you think that's a good idea? Like, why isn't the Chinese team authorized and trained and capable to manage those kind of things without these guys by this point? So these are all of the things that I think feed into weakness in operations.
Kimberly, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your insights, and we wish you all the best and, good luck and stay safe. And hopefully you'll be able to return to China soon.
Thank you. Yeah. Wonderful talking to you. Thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market, exponentially so.